So we'll give it another minute, and if you'd like to say hi to each other, feel free. Get started, at least with the introductory remarks. We still have people joining us. This is a fantastic crowd. Thanks everybody for making time to come today. We have a lot of students with us. Welcome to all of you. Good to see you. We have colleagues from across campus and beyond campus. Hi, Peter. It's so good to see you. And then a really special welcome to our numerous alumni who are in attendance. Welcome back to Macalester for you as well, at least virtually. Our talk tonight is part of the 2020-2021 virtual speakers series in geography. We really miss, obviously, seeing each other in person and having speakers and presentations and discussions. So this is filling a niche in that way, and it's been a great success. The people that we have invited this year to be part of the speaker series are younger scholars who are working at the cutting edge of geography and on socially relevant issues. And that, of course, includes Dr. Attoh, who is speaking tonight. We hosted Dr. Adam Bledsoe from the University of Minnesota last fall. And earlier this spring, we hosted Dr. Lindsay Naylor from the University of Delaware. And then in just a couple of weeks, we have another presentation by Dr. Robert Walker, who's coming to us from the University of Florida, speaking on avoiding Amazonian catastrophes in the 21st century. And I want to give a special thanks to my colleagues, Bill Mosley, Dan Trudeau, Catherine Chang, and Javier Haro Carrion for being the organizing committee for this speaker series, because it's really been great and we've all benefited so much from it. So thanks to all of you. The format for tonight is that Dr. Attoh will speak for about half hour or 35 minutes, and then we'll leave the last 20 minutes for discussion and questions and answers. So just for everybody's information who is attending, we are going to record Dr. Attoh's presentation itself, but we will not be recording the Q&A. So that will allow people who weren't able to join us to see his presentation. And I think that's it for logistics. So now I will introduce Kafui, who graduated from Macalester in 2006. And it's so good to see him back in a Macalester group. He majored in geography and Spanish. And then he went to Syracuse for both his master's and his PhD, which he finished in 2013. So he received tenure about a year ago. He is currently associate professor. Congratulations, huge congratulations to Kafui. A professor of urban studies at the City University of New York in the School of Labor and Urban Studies. So I will call him Kafui because I remember him as even more of a youngster, but Dr. Attoh's research interests are in the political economy of cities, the politics of public space, and debates around the idea of the right to the city, and specifically focusing on the role of urban transit. And that's going to be the focus of his talk tonight. His publications include also a fairly recently, 2019, published book from the University of Georgia Press called Rights in Transit: Public Transportation and the Right to the City in California's East Bay. And I think that is going to be kind of the focus of his talk tonight. He also has numerous publications, articles in journals such as Progress in Human Geography, Environment and Planning, both A and D, Urban Studies, etc. So the last national meeting that we were able to attend in person, 2019, Laura Keegan and I were lucky enough to be able to go to Kafui's talk. And we are so excited to have him back and to have you all with us for his presentation tonight. So please join me in welcoming Kafui, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. All right. Yeah. So first, let me say how grateful I am to Laura Bill and the other Laura Keegan, for organizing this. And I didn't realize there was a whole committee. So thank you to them as well. Of course, I should also say, I owe a tremendous amount to Macalester and to many of the people on this call, for sparking my interest in geography and all sorts of other things, and for setting me on the path that I'm continuing to walk along. So I'm just incredibly honored to be able to be back at Mac, if only virtually, I guess. I mean, so thanks so much. Why am I back? Well, I'm here largely to talk about this book, or the book that Laura mentioned, Rights in Transit, which came out in 2019. And that was based on research I conducted between 2010 and 2014 in California's East Bay, and largely on the kind of major transit provider in the region, which was AC Transit. So for people who don't know East Bay, I'm referencing a region just east of San Francisco, Oakland, Richmond, Hayward, El Cerrito, Berkeley. And I often start by saying, especially to audiences outside of the Bay Area, that, although it's set in the Bay Area, the arguments I'm making in the book extend beyond that region, beyond California. And I hope you see that through the presentation. And those arguments are largely on how to think about public transportation politically. So I thought I'd begin to talk with a brief anecdote, and it's an anecdote that I've used many times before, and that's in the book toward the end, but that I think goes some way in introducing some of the themes of the book. So the anecdote starts here in the city of Berkeley, and it starts with this map. So this is a map of the B line. B line is Berkeley's own municipal transit system. It's a system that operates a total of 7 routes throughout the city, all around the same length. Line B1, which you can see in the red, takes you from the top of Telegraph Avenue all the way to Berkeley's restaurant district, or the gourmet ghetto, as they call it. B3 in the blue runs from downtown Berkeley to the 4th Street Business District. B6 in the purple is the Shasta Grizzly Loop, which serves the relatively affluent Berkeley Hills, and it kind of weaves a windy course through some really nice neighborhoods. B4 is in the green, connects downtown Berkeley to the city of Emeryville and the Bay Street Shopping District. And a large portion, you don't see this in the map, a large portion of the B line's costs are covered by contributions from local businesses and UC Berkeley, who both see the system as kind of a part of a wider effort to promote environmental sustainability. So as a result of all that, the B line's fares are set at a relatively affordable $1. So it's a pretty good transit system. Of course, if you're at all familiar with Berkeley, or if you've read the book, you'll know that everything I just said is a complete lie. There's no such thing as the B line. It's fake. In 2010, however, when I was doing the research for the book, maps of the B line were everywhere. They were in Berkeley, parts of Oakland, parts of Richmond, and they were, plastered on telephone poles and bus shelters. And I remember getting my own copy at a protest I was attending in downtown Oakland that had been organized in response to a set of proposed service cuts at AC Transit. And since I had come to the East Bay ostensibly to study transit issues, I immediately wanted to kind of follow up and figure out what is going on. And fortunately enough for me, the map came with a link to a website, and that website had a link to the map's creator, and map's creator was named Kristen Lawson. It took about a month, but I eventually tracked Lawson down for an interview, and the interview was fantastic. During the interview, I learned that Lawson, his primary occupation was he was a writer, that he had authored several books with his wife, including The Scavenger's Manifesto, Weird Europe, and Darwin and Evolution for Kids, his life and ideas with 21 activities. And of course, we talked a lot about the beeline. First thing, Lawson said about the beeline was this: it's 100% a dream. There's no reality to it. It may look like it's official, but that's because I'm very good at making things look official. But all it is one lunatic, that's me, coming up with an idea, making a whole route map, designing it as if it were a real bus system, and then just announcing that it's a real and having public meetings. If enough people assume that it's real, then it becomes real. That's how things happen in the world. At the time, this seemed all rather strange and a quite remarkable claim. Even more remarkable, however, were kind of the reasons that Lawson gave for creating the beeline. In 1994, Lawson explained he had gotten this incredible deal on a house in the Berkeley Hills, something that he normally couldn't afford. And one of the deciding factors in buying the house was that there were two AC transit lines less than 1 block away. The first was the 65, the second was the 8 line. And these were both really great lines. Unfortunately, right after buying the house and moving in, AC Transit decided to cancel the 8 and to cut back service on the 65. 2010, and when I was conducting the interview with him, AC Transit started, thinking about, eliminating the 65 altogether. And so with the prospect of losing the only bus he had left, Lawson looked around and said, why doesn't someone make a better bus system? Why don't I make a better bus system? So taking a step back and, to be totally fair to Kristen Lawson, there are at least like 2 big things that he wanted to communicate to me about what he was trying to do. The first was that none of this was set in stone. This was simply an opening gambit. It was like a provocation. I understand that everyone is going to, come out and say, this should go there, and this line is stupid, or my house is there, and everyone is going to argue. And I don't care about the details. I just want to get something going, and the details can be figured out later. For Lawson, the beeline was above all about getting a conversation going. It was about encouraging people simply to imagine a different type of transit system, one that was kind of more in line with their needs, one that they deserved. So that's the first thing. The second big picture thing that Lawson wanted to communicate was that none of this was political. For Lawson, the beeline was not about politics. In fact, politics was the problem. The problem is that in Berkeley and probably in other places, transit becomes politics. Everything gets entwined with all these political agendas, and I want to stay away from that. And he wanted to stay away from social justice. When people say social justice, they don't really care about justice. They want transit and buses. They want it's like an implement of the revolution. The beeline, according to Lawson, was not about that. It was not about draining the coffers of the wealthy for some revolutionary purpose. It was not about oppression or rights. It was not about social justice or addressing past wrongs. It was simply about making something that worked for everyone, period, and full stop. So what do we make of this? How do we make sense of this? Well, much of kind of what I end up arguing in the book is that on the one hand, Lawson is correct. There is, in fact, a desperate need to imagine a radically different transportation system. Where transportation is one of the top 2 contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, and where a significant proportion of those come from private automobiles, we owe it to future generations to build cities that allow more and more people to trade in their cars and SUVs for a seat on a public bus. Beyond the environmental argument, of course, there's also a social equity argument. Outside of New York City and a couple of other metropolitan areas, the majority of the people who rely on mass transit are low income, the elderly, and the disabled. And when transit is cut, these are the very people who have the fewest resources to fight back. You know, as a consequence, we live in a reality where this is the norm, where we celebrate the gifting of a car to one individual by way of a GoFundMe campaign and never ask, well, where's transit? Where's transit in all of this? It's also a reality where a huge number of people must take out massive amounts of debt in the form of a car loan simply to get around. And so where this is the reality, you know, Lawson's right. There is a need to imagine something radically different. On the other hand, and given everything we know about how the world actually works, Lawson is also wrong, right? And he is wrong on the very issue that seems the most obvious, namely politics and the inevitability of politics. You know, however much we might want it to be the case, the idea of simply avoiding, you know, the world of politics or ignoring questions of justice and equity, you know, that's crazy. it's to ignore reality. Just ask anyone who has ever dared to whisper about eliminating parking or removing a traffic lane. Just you see the red dot appear on their on their shirt. And so for anyone who is really serious about change or serious about offering an alternative to our current system, the question, you know, is clear. The question is not, you know, how to avoid politics, but rather what types of politics and what types of political claims make sense for the world we need. And so where this is the question, where this is the starting point, the book's answers to talk about rights, both the idea of a right to public transit, as well as the rights that public transit makes possible. You know, and so in the introduction, I lay out kind of three arguments. These arguments are rights matter, you know, and despite kind of a long tradition that is skeptical of rights talk, that they remain valuable tools for enacting change and mobilizing people. Second is that there are different types of rights and that those differences are important when we talk about socioeconomic rights or civil rights or group rights. We are talking about different conceptions of what a right is or what it ought to be. And those differences both shape and are shaped by our politics. Lastly, the book argues that there is a kind of desperate need for those committed to transportation justice to talk as much about civil rights as they do about what I call a right to the city. And for me, that means engaging a set of larger questions. These are questions on the broader political economy, on labor and the rights of labor, and they are questions about transit's place or relationship to public life, democratic participation, and the dangers of what I call urban idiocy, which I'll talk about later. So for the rest of the talk, I'd like to focus on developing like this last bit in the yellow, namely what it would mean for transportation justice or politics to center kind of these broader questions that I'm just laid out. So, you know, for many people, any reference to transportation justice starts here, namely with the Montgomery Bus Boycott in 1955. The boycott is famous not only because it succeeded in challenging transit racism in one city, but because it served as one of many catalysts for a much larger civil rights movement. That's a movement that led to the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ostensibly outlawed racial discrimination in the provision of public services. And while explicit racial discrimination is illegal, there are very few people who would deny the fact that transportation resources today continue to be divided along racial and economic lines. Indeed, there are any number of groups who have focused on pointing this out and fighting for the rights of minority riders in cities across the country. One of those groups is Los Angeles Bus Riders Union. In 1996, they gained national attention after they successfully sued the Los Angeles MTA for violating the rights of minority riders. And yeah, as I was developing the research project, I kept going back to them and reading about what had happened, what was going on. In 2008, a similar case was taken up in the East Bay, and it's a case I write about in the book. This was a case involving Sylvia Derensberg. Sylvia Derensberg was an African-American bus rider in Oakland who, along with several other minority riders, accused the Bay Area MTC, which is the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the 9-county region there, of violating Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. More specifically, they accused the MTC of allocating federal and state resources in ways that while ostensibly race neutral, had a disproportionately negative impact on minority riders who used AC Transit, which was centered in Oakland. Their argument in many ways was captured in this graph, which I just put up. As the plaintiffs argued, and based on public subsidies across different transit carriers, what you saw in the Bay Area was a separate and an unequal transit system. The greater the proportion of white riders, it was found, the more likely a transit carrier would receive greater relative public subsidies per rider. There's a lot in the case, and I can talk about that later, that complicates this picture a bit. But the chapter hinges largely on the legal arguments around it and what ended up happening to those legal arguments. In 2009, the district court actually sided with the MTC and against Derensberg. According to the court, while the MTC's funding allocation was ostensibly neutral, it clearly had a disparate impact on minority riders, but the MTC's budget was justified because it served to meet the agency's other legal obligations. That is, despite it having a disparate impact, it met a quote unquote business necessity. And that business necessity included promoting global economic competitiveness and regional connectivity, among other things. Part of the book suggests that, that the transportation justice advocates had a rather weak case, but it provided a unique opportunity for those committed to transportation justice to kind of see the light and to shift the focus away from Title VI claims alone to focusing their critique on this, namely the degree to which the MTC had become beholden to a set of broader economic priorities and the vagaries that come with global competition for investment that all cities are forced to engage in. The focus should be on here and on pointing out the fundamental limits of equity, where this kind of remains the central and fundamental goal of transit. Today, I think this refocus is even more important given shifts in the racial geography in the Bay Area. For example, today, if you go to like Oakland, or gentrification pressures have actually served to push poor and minority communities out of the central city and precisely into areas where BART is the sole transit provider now. These pressures had already begun in 2008. So in short, the city was changing even as the approach to transit equity remained the same. And that's kind of what the chapter tries to outline. There's actually a better way of making the same point. And it actually begins, it actually means going back to Montgomery, Alabama. In the year 2000, the writer Joan Wojciechowski wrote a really great piece in The Nation magazine that had this subtitle: Montgomery's transit system isn't segregated anymore, it barely exists. In the article, she explains that in the late 1990s and after the federal government eliminated operating subsidies to local transit, officials in Montgomery responded by replacing all fixed route service with a subscription dial-a-ride service. It's basically like paratransit. This new system sucked. It was a disaster. There were missed calls, slow commute times, and poor geographic coverage. When the Democrats regained power in the city, they restored fixed route service, but even then the service was nowhere near what it had been in 1955. The most ironic part of the story was that at the same time that all of this was happening in Montgomery, the city had received federal and state support to build a museum to honor the Montgomery Bus Boycott and to encourage tourism and investment. So in 2010, if you wanted to see the original bus that started it all, that was easy. Much harder was actually catching a bus to get to the museum. In 2000, the problem was not that Black people had to sit in the back of the bus, but that federal disinvestment, white flight, suburbanization, interurban competition, capital flight, global transformation of the economy meant that there was no buses at all. So in the face of such broader political economic changes to the city, as was clear, in the East Bay, a commitment to transportation justice will need to be about far more than anti-discrimination or demand for civil rights alone, right? And so that was kind of one section of the book. So let me switch gears and talk a bit about labor and what labor adds to the discussion of transportation justice and the politics of transit. So in 2010, when I first arrived in Oakland, AC Transit workers were in the midst of a prolonged labor dispute. This was a dispute over both pension contributions and healthcare premiums. The company, AC Transit, was facing a $52 million shortfall, and they were playing hardball with the workers. In June 2010, AC Transit Board of Directors did what at the time seemed rather unthinkable. Rather than negotiate with labor, they simply imposed a new contract without consultation. The response from drivers was immediate. For the first time in 33 years, AC Transit workers mounted a sick out, as they called it. While there was some debate over whether this was an official strike or something else, the impact was the same. Tens of thousands of bus riders in the East Bay found themselves stranded at their bus stops and late for work. Management was quick to jump on this point. AC Transit's general manager at the time was a woman named Mary King, and her response to the sick out, which was published in the newspaper, was clear: unvarnished condemnation. To simply not show up for their obligated assignments, to leave other workers, children, seniors, disabled, elderly passengers without warning and no transportation. It's unacceptable. Her point was this: not only were bus drivers and mechanics at AC Transit abandoning their duty to the public, but they were abandoning a particular public. They were abandoning the disabled, the poor, the transit dependent. These were riders who relied on transit to accomplish their most basic needs. Worse still, transit workers were abandoning the public for the sole purpose of clinging to benefits that most people considered overly generous anyway, especially in comparison to many of the people they carried, was the argument. The response from drivers was really twofold. The first response was simply to offer a very different definition of the public. Against accusations of inconveniencing the public and riders, drivers' retort was clear. Well, we are the public too. the public is us. In late 2010, I interviewed Claudia Hudson, the then president of the union, and she told me more or less the same thing. The people who catch the bus, the people who drive the bus, and the people who fix the bus are one and the same. They are fighting for transportation dollars to keep transportation public and to keep it available for people to be able to utilize it. We are fighting for the same thing, but we're also fighting to maintain our working conditions while we provide the service. David Lyons, a 30-year veteran of AC Transit, said more or less the same thing. We do make more than a lot of the people we carry, but on the other hand, if we lose, it doesn't mean they gain. In fact, it's usually the opposite. If you try to set a standard that other workers can shoot for, they can point to you as they enter negotiations. Of course, there's a long history of labor advocacy and labor advocates in the East Bay and elsewhere, making this same point. In 1946, in the midst of the Oakland general strike, the Weekly People published a response to a set of editorials bemoaning the costs of the general strike to public welfare. And the quote is really good and been one of my favorites for a long time. Generally speaking, science has done a pretty good job on pixies, elves, fairies, spirits, and similar supernatural imps, not to mention spooks and banshees. But there's one superstition that returns to haunt us no matter how often it is laid with scientific facts and logic. It is the mystic public. Right now, the public is suffering the tortures of the damned. According to the mayor of the city, the public has been denied the right to get food, to travel in any form of public transportation, to send their children to school where there are distances to be traveled, to have a daily paper. Resisting the impulse to let our hearts bleed for the public of Oakland and elsewhere, we move in for a closer look at this mysterious creature, which always manages to be right in the middle of a labor dispute. Who is the public? According to the editors, the public is all of us who are not directly involved in the dispute. There isn't the slightest doubt that a lot of people suffer when there's a strike, but these people are workers, therefore, themselves or the families of workers. They are members of the working class with interests in common with all other working men and women who live on wages. In 2010, who was the public? Was it the nurse waiting for a bus in downtown Oakland? Was it the bus driver fighting to keep their benefits? Was it a high school senior trying to get to school? Or was it that student's father who also happened to be a bus mechanic? Of course, for the AC Transit driver, the answer was clear. The public was, as it was in 1946, everyone who lived on wages and everyone defined as the working class. To think otherwise was to give a weapon to management, or worse, it was to miss the reality as presented in graphs like this. Here's a graph of real wages for AC Transit drivers from 1944 to 2007, and below it is a graph of real fares for a similar period. As you can see, the pivot point coincides almost directly with the passage of Proposition 13, which placed a cap on property taxes and functioned to starve most public services in California. Here the picture is one in which drivers and riders, although they sit in different parts of the vehicle, have a shared similar fate, and that fate being, austerity. So stepping back a bit, where the issue is one of transportation justice or the politics of transit, questions around labor are important, not only because they compel us to look at how transportation services are produced, by whom, under what terms, but they compel us to think about the public itself and the ways in which the expansion and contraction of that term can limit or expand our politics. So this is the last section. I think I'm still good on time. And I'd like to take up another set of questions that I explore in the book. These are questions that deal with issues of public life, political participation, as well as the opposite of political participation, namely political kind of alienation or separation. So to do that, I'd like to go back to the very beginning of the book, to the preface. And in the preface, I provide two kind of personal anecdotes that are not based in the East Bay, but actually are based on my own experience. So just talk about myself for a while. The first anecdote kind of goes like this. So it's the fall of 2014. I have a job, yes. I'm living in Poughkeepsie, commuting to New York, back and forth. And my partner and I have, one car, and so I rely on the bus in Poughkeepsie. And on this particular day, I'm working at the library on Vassar College's campus. I'm probably working on the book. And then at some point, I'm ready to come home. And so I do what I usually do, and I head to the corner of College and Raymond Avenue and wait to catch what was then called the Shopper Special. There are 3 other people that are waiting there. So I know I haven't missed it. So we wait and we wait and we wait and we wait some more. And finally, I decide to call the dispatcher to see where's the bus. I get hold of the dispatcher, and the dispatcher tells me, oh, the bus, it's in the shop. It isn't working today. In short, the bus is broken. I tell the other people waiting with me, yeah, the bus is broken, it's not coming. And without a word, they leave and they start to walk home, however far that may be. All right, second anecdote. 2 years later, spring of 2016, again, my partner has the car and I'm on the bus, probably going to the library this time, still working on the book. There are a group of writers up front who are kind of talking. Two older women. One is a young guy who's clearly visually impaired. The conversation is wide ranging, but mostly they're talking about what was happening at the time, which is a proposal to merge the city of Poughkeepsie system with the county system, which is Dutchess County. Advocates of the proposal have touted the consolidation as a cost-saving measure. Writers, they're skeptical. Would consolidation mean more buses or less buses, more service or less service? Would there be longer wait times or shorter wait times? Would it mean newer buses or the same old ones that we're used to? According to one of the people who's talking, her advice for anyone moving to Poughkeepsie is get a car as soon as you can. So the conversation goes on and on like this, and at some point the bus driver, who is apparently listening to this whole conversation, chimes in and says, hey, you guys have a lot to say. You should take your comments to the Common Council meeting. It would be good, he said, to hear from actual writers for a change. In response, one of the two ladies laughed. City council meetings were held at 6:30. The last bus left more or less at the same time. Even if transit riders could get to the council, there'd be no bus to take them home. Both anecdotes, just to reference this line on the screen, are examples of what I describe in the book as the quintessentially idiotic nature of public transit in most cities. And here I'm using idiocy in two senses of the word. In the first sense, it's simply a way to describe the various ill-conceived transit policies that are part and parcel of living in the US. There's stupid ways we do shit in cities. These are policies that mean that everyone in Poughkeepsie can, in some instances, be only one broken bus away from walking everywhere. The second sense of idiocy is the more complicated one. Here I'm drawing on the kind of classical conception of idiocy. In ancient Athens, to be an idiotus or idiot was to be a person separate from the political and public life of the city. It's to be a private individual, a private citizen not involved in the democratic process. And it's this conception of idiocy that Marx and Engels were using in the manifesto when they were writing about the growth of the industrial city and the role of capitalism and rescuing a considerable part of that population from the isolation of rural life. For them, the rise of cities like Manchester, Glasgow, and the growth of industrial factories meant that formerly isolated workers could finally come together and engage in kind of collective struggle. Where transit service stops before city council hearings, where poor transit prevents the disabled from reaching the polls or simply attending a rally, where poor transit prevents people from being part of the public life of a city, and where it condemns them to lives of privatized isolation, it produces idiocy and gives lie for those who truly rely on it, on the promises of real democratic participation. Poor transit makes idiots of us all. That's basically what I'm saying, in short. So let's go back to the beginning, to Kristen Lawson and the Beeline. So as I argued, on the one hand, this book starts from the presumption that Lawson is absolutely correct, that there is in fact a desperate need to think creatively about mass transit, to imagine something much better. The reality in Poughkeepsie, like the reality in many other locales, runs counter to kind of basic principles of justice and environmental stewardship. On the other hand, this book also argues that the suggestion that we can do this or that we can create something better without politics is insane. The question for the book and the question for anyone engaged in struggles for transportation justice is thus simple. What kind of politics makes sense? What kind of politics ought we to engage in, given the world we live in, part of the book suggests that any effective politics will take seriously the questions described above and described through anecdotes or case studies. These are questions of political economy, questions of labor, and questions on the nature of urban idiocy, or how we participate in public life. What this means, of course, is that we move beyond questions of civil rights to take up some broader questions associated with our right to the city. This is all to say, that if we are really interested in creating our own beelines or creating a new transit system that meets the needs of the majority of people who live in cities, that we need to think clearly about the types of politics or the type of politics that moves us in that direction. And that's it. Am I under time?
You are perfect, Kafui. Thank you.
Right. Let me stop.
Yes, so we will now enter the discussion